This story is so much more fantastical than any of the resurrection stories you'd find in the modern Bible.
The Bible existed in multiple forms and was not finalized. Probably even in the time of Jesus, there were somewhat different forms of the text in circulation.
For centuries, scholars have hunted for lost pages of Scripture, searching dusty libraries and forgotten monasteries for any trace of what time erased.
Because this library is an archive of the history of Christianity and its neighbors in the Mediterranean world, and therefore is of interest to communities all over the world who find their history here.
Most searches ended in disappointment, but deep within the Vatican, one page began to reveal itself beneath layers of ink. Its words hadn't been seen for 1,000 years. Then, with help from artificial intelligence, those lost lines returned, revealing something no one expected. The page that wouldn't vanish. In the ancient world, a single page could live more than one life. First, it carries a story. Then, when parchment runs short, someone scrapes the ink away and writes something new on top. Later, that same page might be reused again. Parchment came from animal skin. It took time, work, and animals to make. Every blank sheet represented labor and cost. Reusing it was common sense. Scholars have a word for pages like that: palimpsests. The older writing underneath is called the undertext, and the newer words on top are the overtext.
Peering at it, she could see at the top of the pages, according to Luke, according to Matthew. And she knew from this that it was a palimpsest.
Sometimes there are two or more layers. When the original text is buried under two newer ones, it's called a double palimpsest. One of those reused pages has now changed what we know about early Christian history. In April of 2023, the Austrian Academy of Sciences announced that medievalist Gregory Kessel had found an erased Old Syriac copy of the Gospel of Matthew in a Vatican manuscript, a page whose oldest words were 2 layers down. The erased section holds a continuous run from Matthew chapter 11, verse 30, through chapter 12, verse 26. That is a large and complete stretch for any ancient fragment. Most finds this old are single lines or broken scraps. Even more important, this one belongs to a very early translation family called the Old Syriac. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, the everyday language many people spoke across the Eastern Mediterranean during the first centuries of Christianity. As the gospel stories spread east from Greek-speaking regions, local communities translated them into Syriac so they could be read and preached in their own tongue. Those early translations became known as the Old Syriac Gospels. They sit centuries earlier than the later, smoother Syriac Bible known as the Peshitta. The difference between them is like hearing 2 versions of the same song. The melody is the same, but in the earlier one, the rhythm and tone still carry traces of the original singer's voice. Those details, small word choices, short phrases, and shifts in rhythm, help historians hear how the stories first sounded when spoken aloud.
Maggie and Agnes knew the codex was a palimpsest, so they acquired an experimental chemical called hydrosulfide of ammonia to bring out the undertext.
For decades, historians knew only 3 manuscripts in that Old Syriac line: the Curatonianus in London, the Syriac Sinaiticus at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, and a small group of fragments identified by the Sinai Palimpsests Project. Kessel's Vatican leaf became the 4th. The way it survived feels almost accidental. The Vatican study shows that the Syriac Gospel page didn't remain part of its original book. At some point, someone cut and folded it so it could be reused as binding material for a later Georgian prayer book known as an iadgari. In the process, the edges were trimmed, the margins shaved, and part of a column sliced away. The page lost its shape, but that destruction is exactly what saved it. Today, the surviving leaf measures about 10.5 inches tall and 6 inches wide. Before it was trimmed, the full page would have been around 12 by 9 inches, roughly the size of a magazine. That matches the dimensions of other Syriac Gospel manuscripts from the 6th century. The size alone tells us it once belonged to a full, formal Gospel book, not a loose fragment or a small devotional note. By studying what remains, scholars could estimate its original scope. This single page holds about 0.6% of the entire Gospel text. Multiply that out, and the lost book it came from probably had around 160 folios, bound in 16 gatherings. That would make it a normal gospel codex of its time, large enough to read from, small enough to carry.
Maggie and Agnes knew the codex was a palimpsest, so they acquired an experimental chemical called hydrosulfide of ammonia to bring out the undertext.
Dating the page is straightforward. The handwriting style places it in the first half of the 6th century. That's the age of the copy, not of the translation itself. The old Syriac line that this page belongs to goes back much earlier, into the 3rd century, making it one of the earliest surviving echoes of the gospel story in another language. Experts identified the handwriting as a clean estrangula style common in northern Syria around that time, its straight strokes and narrow loops matching other 6th century Syriac codices from the region of Edessa. The Vatican volume that hides this gospel leaf has its own history. It was known to scholars in the mid-20th century, then misplaced in the catalog system, rediscovered in 2010, and finally digitized in 2020. The page was sitting on a shelf the whole time, just waiting for the right eyes to see it. That rediscovery wasn't luck. It was the result of deep knowledge and patience. Grigory Kessel is a specialist in early Syriac manuscripts. He knows how to spot their shapes, inks, and angles, even when they've been scraped almost flat, using high-resolution, multispectral imaging. He examined the Vatican scans and saw faint strokes under the later writing, enough to identify the lost gospel beneath. The irony is striking. What once looked like a ruined scrap turned out to be one of the oldest surviving translations of a gospel on earth. To picture why that's important, think of the Gospels as a branching river. Near the source, the current is fast and pure. Farther downstream, the river divides into smaller branches, each one carrying traces of change, different word choices, unique copying habits, and the gradual shifts that come with time. Most modern Bibles come from far downstream, polished and standardized, but old Syriac manuscripts are like small pools close to the source. They preserve a rawer version of the text. Each new manuscript helps scholars trace how the message flowed and changed across languages and time. To understand how we even got here, you have to meet the people who chased these pages before anyone else. The hunt for lost gospels. In the winter of 1892, 2 sisters from Scotland rode into the Sinai desert. Their names were Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlop Gibson, middle-aged, self-taught, and fiercely curious.
2 twin spinster Presbyterian widows who discovered some very important early Syriac manuscripts of the New Testament in the Sinai desert.
They carried cameras, notebooks, and an unusual talent for languages. Between them, they knew enough Greek, Hebrew, and Syriac to talk their way into almost any monastery. What brought them across the desert wasn't fame or funding. It was a rumor that high on the slopes of a granite mountain stood a monastery where time had slowed and where old books were never thrown away. When they arrived at St. Catherine's Monastery, the air was dry, thin, and still. Inside its thick walls, a library older than most nations was waiting. The shelves were lined with parchment volumes, darkened by centuries of use. Some had been there since the age of the Roman Empire. The sisters began to look through them, carefully turning the pages under the flicker of lamplight. And then, in a small storeroom, Agnes tilted one book toward the light and froze. Beneath the visible writing, she saw another layer of letters faintly shining through. What she had found was a palimpsest, but the underlayer turned out to be something extraordinary. An early Syriac version of the Gospels, copied more than 1,000 years earlier. That single discovery, later named the Syriac Sinaiticus, changed biblical scholarship overnight. The sisters returned in 1893 with a small team from Cambridge, carrying better cameras. Page by page, they photographed the hidden writing and brought the erased text back into view for the first time in centuries. St. Catherine's Monastery sits at the foot of Mount Sinai and has been home to monks and manuscripts for almost 1,500 years. It's one of the oldest continuously operating Christian libraries in the world.
The library is said to contain manuscripts belonging to the Greek physician Hippocrates and a rare version of the Bible.
The monks there didn't throw books away. They repaired them, rebound them, and tucked them safely back on the shelves. The desert's dry air did the rest. That's why a fragile gospel book could survive until the sisters arrived. Once the news spread, more scholars joined the effort. Cambridge professors Robert Bensley and Francis Burkitt brought their expertise, while J. Rendell Harris handled logistics. Agnes herself edited and published the text so that anyone could study it without crossing the desert. In 1910, her massive volume Evangelion de Mephiresha printed the Syriac palimpsest in full. From that moment, the twins' nickname, the Sisters of Sinai, became legend. Across the sea, another piece of the same puzzle sat in a very different setting, London's British Museum, later the British Library. There, a manuscript known as the Curatonianus had been catalogued and studied in the 19th century. It contained another old Syriac translation of the Gospels, close in language and time to the one the sisters had found. Together, these two books, the Curatonianus in London and the Syriac Sinaiticus at Sinai, became the twin pillars of what scholars call the Old Syriac tradition, early vivid translations that preserve how the gospel stories first sounded in the language of the East. St. Catherine's Library, meanwhile, wasn't finished revealing its treasures. In 1975, during building repairs, workers opened a sealed space in the northern wall and found what the monks now call the New Finds. Inside were around 1,100 manuscript fragments, a buried archive within the archive. Among them were more palimpsests, and even parts of the Codex Sinaiticus, the famous Greek Bible, whose earlier discovery had already shaken the academic world. It's one of the most heavily corrected manuscripts in existence. Across its pages, scholars have counted roughly 23,000 correction marks, evidence that generation after generation of readers studied it closely enough to adjust the text.
To transcribe the undertext of the palimpsest correctly, they would need the help of more experienced Syriac readers.
Then came the Sinai Palimpsests Project, launched to reveal erased texts hiding beneath later writing. St. Catherine's holds more than 160 palimpsest manuscripts, many with underlayers dating back to the 4th and 5th centuries. A partnership between the monastery and the University of California, Los Angeles, used new imaging technology to photograph those erased lines under different colors of light. Over 5 years, they digitized 74 palimpsest codices, nearly 7,000 pages, written in 10 languages. The results included forgotten sermons, scientific notes, school exercises, and early Christian writings that see the ancient world in a new light. This is where politics quietly enters the story. Libraries survive only when the people who guard them are allowed to do so. In June of 2025, after a court ruling in Egypt concerning land near the monastery, officials from Greece and Egypt met and promised to protect St. Catherine's status. A few months later, Greece's prime minister announced that both governments had reached an agreement ensuring the monastery's religious and cultural independence. The deal would guarantee that its churches, chapels, and library could never be converted or repurposed. When the erased ink beneath Kessel's discovery came into view, it told a story no one expected. What the hidden page revealed. Under ultraviolet light, the page began to speak again. The erased Syriac letters, faint as dust, slowly reappeared, pale strokes curling out of centuries of silence. Then came the hard part. Scholars used artificial intelligence to help piece the words together, matching tiny traces of ink, smoothing gaps, and restoring order. The AI model helped experts see what was already there. The judgment, the meaning, and the decisions all came from human eyes. And what those eyes found was stunning. The first shift appears right at the start of Matthew chapter 12. In most printed Bibles, the story goes like this. The disciples walk through grain fields on the Sabbath, pick the heads of grain, and eat them. But on this newly recovered Syriac page, one more action appears. The disciples, it says, began to pick the heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat them. That small gesture changes everything. Suddenly, the scene comes alive. Husks crack between fingers. Chaff drifts in the air, and the reason for the argument that follows makes sense. When the Pharisees saw the disciples rubbing the grain, they claimed it counted as work, something forbidden on the Sabbath. That one added motion ties directly to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, which also mentions rubbing the grain. This new leaf doesn't stop there. It continues from the final line of chapter 11 all the way through much of chapter 12. That stretch connects Jesus' words, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light," to everything that comes next. The walk through the grain fields, the healing in the synagogue, and the arguments that follow about law, compassion, and what it really means to rest on the Sabbath. Seeing all those scenes together helps scholars understand the rhythm of the story, how one moment leads naturally into the next, instead of looking at each verse in isolation. When Grigory Kessel compared it line by line with other early Syriac manuscripts, the result was clear. The Vatican page walks in lockstep with one of the oldest Syriac Gospels known, the Curatonianus in the British Library. That shows this wasn't a rogue translation or a copyist's experiment. It was part of the same early stream that we already recognize as Old Syriac, where the Curatonianus and the Sinaitic palimpsest stand together against the later standardized Syriac Bible, the Peshitta. The Vatican page joins them. And when the first two diverge, the new page repeatedly sides with the Curatonianus. First, in the openings and connectors, early Syriac translators didn't aim for polished literature. They wanted something that sounded natural when spoken aloud in church. The Vatican page keeps that same cadence. Small connective words, short bridges, the easy rhythm of dialogue. The story flows like speech, not like law. Second, in the heart of the argument, the part about the priests working on the Sabbath. In this Syriac version, the sentences follow the same arrangement found in the Curatonianus. The temple example, the reminder of David's hunger, and the famous line, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," appear in the same order, building a smooth, spoken logic that pulls listeners along. Third, in the moment of healing. When Jesus enters the synagogue and restores the man's withered hand, the lines once again match the Curatonianus almost word for word. That gives us an unbroken Syriac corridor from the grain field to the synagogue. And finally, as the chapter turns to the argument over Beelzebul, when critics accuse Jesus of driving out demons by demonic power, the page keeps its course. The questions, the responses, and the logic about divided kingdoms all align with the same early Syriac pattern. What Grigory Kessel found is now shaking the foundations of modern biblical study. How this discovery is rewriting Bible history. The discovery of that erased Syriac gospel page started a chain reaction. The first ripple lands exactly where you'd expect, on the desks of people who build the official editions of the New Testament. These are the books that define what most Bibles print, line by line. Two names dominate that world. The Nestle Aland Novum Testamentum Grace, used by nearly every modern translator, and the Editio Critica Maior, or ECM, which is the massive detailed foundation that feeds into it. The ECM is built in Münster, Germany, and its team describes their mission as nothing less than mapping the first 1,000 years of the New Testament's life. Every known Greek manuscript, every early translation, every major variant. When a new early witness like this Syriac page appears, it doesn't replace the Greek, it stabilizes it. If the Greek manuscripts disagree, an older translation can sometimes show which line was understood first. If you've ever looked at a Bible and wondered what that thin band of notes at the bottom means, that's the critical apparatus. It lists all the places where manuscripts disagree and shows who reads what. Each early version, whether Latin, Coptic, or Syriac, is marked carefully because even one word's placement can change the rhythm or balance of a scene. When this newly recovered Syriac leaf began lining up perfectly with other early Syriac texts, that consistency guaranteed its seat at the table. Over time, it will quietly become part of how every new edition is checked and corrected. The Vatican page won't rewrite Matthew's Gospel. It will keep future editors honest. This process takes patience. The ECM has been unfolding for decades, book by book, and will keep rolling out through the 20s. Each edition is logged online, where updates never have to wait for reprints. That means this Syriac page is already on its way to being woven into the permanent record. Dating is the next shockwave. For centuries, experts estimated a manuscript's age mostly by its handwriting, how letters curve, how much pressure the pen leaves, and how those traits match other dated samples. It's careful work, but not exact. Now labs are pushing that boundary with a mix of radiocarbon dating and AI handwriting analysis. At the University of Groningen, researchers re-examined fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls that had been contaminated decades ago with castor oil. After cleaning and retesting, they paired the results with an AI program called Enoch, trained to read handwriting like a fingerprint expert. The model analyzed 24 securely dated samples and used their patterns to estimate the age of over 100 undated fragments. In nearly 8 out of 10 cases, its predictions matched human experts within a few decades. That kind of precision means an ancient page can now be placed more confidently in time. The same logic now filters into Christian manuscript studies. If a leaf like the Vatican Syriac fragment can be dated within a tighter window, say early 6th century rather than around the 6th century, that precision gives it more authority in the editing chain. Earlier copies always speak louder, but the handwriting itself tells another story. In 2021, researchers led by Mladen Popovic used similar AI tools to prove that the famous Great Isaiah Scroll wasn't written by one scribe, but by two. For decades, people assumed a single writer had kept the same steady hand for all 66 chapters. The new analysis showed otherwise. 2 different people, with nearly identical habits, alternating sections. That discovery didn't just solve a who wrote what mystery. It showed how workshops actually worked, how scribes shared labor, and how small quirks like stroke width or letter spacing can reveal hidden teamwork behind ancient books. The Groningen team is already testing where their AI model and radiocarbon dating disagree, using those gaps to refine both methods. Machines don't replace judgment, they sharpen it. The best researchers treat AI like a flashlight that helps them see faster, not a brain that tells them what to think. That balance matters because this field has already lived through a few painful lessons about rushing and hype. In 2012, a tiny scrap of papyrus surfaced with a line that seemed to quote Jesus calling someone, "my wife." Headlines screamed about a lost gospel. Within months, linguists and papyrologists began to raise alarms. The grammar sounded too modern. The The phrasing matched an already known forgery, and no one could trace a clear history for where the fragment came from. By 2016, an investigation proved it was fake, created from snippets of a 19th century Coptic text. The scholar who first published it admitted she'd been deceived. A few years later, the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., learned the same lesson at a far higher cost. The museum had spent millions buying what it thought were genuine Dead Sea Scroll fragments. Scientific testing in 2018 showed that several were modern forgeries. 2 years later, a full forensic report confirmed the worst. All fragments in the collection were fake, probably cut from old leather and painted to look ancient. Even good faith mistakes can sting. For years, whispers spread about a first-century fragment of the Gospel of Mark, supposedly the earliest copy ever found. When it was finally published in 2018, it turned out to date from the late 2nd or early 3rd century. Still valuable, but not groundbreaking. The fallout from all those moments built a few simple rules. Share the images, share the shelf mark, publish in a peer-reviewed journal where other specialists can challenge you, tie your claims to clear lab data, spell out what a computer helped with and what the human editor decided. And above all, never announce a new gospel without showing your evidence. The Vatican Syriac discovery checked every one of those boxes. Behind all this are quiet revolutions inside libraries themselves. Places like the Vatican Library, the British Library, and St. Catherine's Monastery have been opening their vaults to new projects that blend patience with technology. One of the most promising is Incodus Ratio, a Vatican-backed project that uses machine learning to read medieval registers and sort handwriting. The goal isn't to replace people, it's to help them reach the hard parts faster. Scanning an archive that once took years can now be done in months, freeing experts to spend their time on interpretation instead of transcription. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.